The alarms blared throughout the Galactic Institute of Xenoscience as Professor Kluvax stormed down the hallway, his 4 eyes narrowed in anger. Behind him, a human exchange scientist named Brian Foster jogged to keep pace, clutching a data pad that contained the presentation that had just thrown the prestigious academic institution into chaos. "This is absurd, Foster. Completely absurd," Professor Kluvax's voice boomed, echoing off the polished metallic walls of the corridor. His translucent skin pulsed with angry red bioluminescent patterns. "You are making a mockery of established science." Brian tried to maintain his composure, despite the growing audience of alien students and faculty who had stopped to watch the confrontation. "Professor, with all due respect, I've checked my calculations repeatedly. The reaction is theoretically possible in our atmospheric conditions." "Theoretically possible?" Kluvax spun around, his upper limbs gesticulating wildly. "You claim that atoms can undergo rapid oxidation with the release of heat and light? That molecules can break apart and recombine in an exothermic cascade? Preposterous." Brian had arrived at the Galactic Institute just 3 months ago as part of the first human exchange program following Earth's recent contact with the Galactic Federation. The institute, located on the planet Xanthoria, was home to the brightest scientific minds across 17 star systems. He'd been thrilled at the opportunity until he discovered a peculiar gap in their knowledge. "I understand it seems counterintuitive given Xanthorian chemistry," Brian said, trying to sound reasonable. "But on Earth, we've been utilizing this reaction for millennia. We call it fire." Professor Kluvax's skin flashed a deep purple, indicating extreme disdain in Xanthorian body language. "And I told you, Foster, that your fire is an impossibility. Matter simply cannot behave in the manner you describe. The fundamental laws of thermodynamics as established by Grandmaster Zorvan clearly prohibit such a reaction." By now, a crowd had gathered. Among them was Drex, a fellow exchange scientist from the methane-breathing Tolarian species, who had become Brian's closest ally at the Institute. "Perhaps," Drex suggested, his voice bubbling through his respirator unit, "a practical demonstration would resolve this dispute?" Professor Kluvax's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of supreme irritation. "A demonstration of something that cannot exist? What a waste of valuable research time." Brian saw his opportunity. "If I could demonstrate that fire is real, would you be willing to revise your position on Earth chemistry?" The professor's skin cycled through several colors before settling on a confident blue. "If you could demonstrate this impossible phenomenon, which you cannot, I would certainly reconsider my position. But as this is clearly impossible, I have nothing to fear." "Then I accept the challenge," Brian said, extending his hand in the human gesture of agreement. Professor Kluvax stared at the outstretched hand with obvious confusion before reluctantly touching it with one of his upper appendages. "Very well. You have 1 standard week to prepare your demonstration." He spat the last word as if it tasted foul. "But when you fail, and you will fail, you will publicly acknowledge that humans have a primitive understanding of molecular physics." As Professor Kluvax glided away, the crowd dispersed, many of the alien students chittering and buzzing in their native languages, clearly discussing the unusual confrontation they had just witnessed. Drex moved closer to Brian, his environmental suit hissing softly. "That was quite bold, my friend. Kluvax has 17 academic honors and has never been proven wrong in a scientific debate." Brian ran a hand through his hair. "Well, there's a first time for everything. The problem is, I'm not sure how I'm going to create fire in an environment that seems specifically designed to prevent it. Xanthoria's atmosphere contained significantly less oxygen than Earth's and had different atmospheric pressure. Additionally, most materials on the planet had evolved to be naturally flame retardant due to the planet's proximity to its highly volatile sun." "I will help you," Drex said, his translator rendering his bubbling speech into clear, standard galactic. This is exactly the kind of cross-species collaboration the exchange program was created for. Brian smiled at his alien friend. Thanks, Drex. I think I'm going to need all the help I can get. Over the next few days, Brian and Drex worked tirelessly in one of the Institute's smaller laboratories. They had been granted access by Dr. Tellis, a junior faculty member who had always found Kluvax's dismissive attitude toward other species' scientific contributions to be troubling. The oxygen content is too low, Brian muttered, looking at the atmospheric readouts. Even if I had a match, it wouldn't stay lit. What about using a controlled environment? Drex suggested, his methane-breathing apparatus making soft clicking sounds as he moved around the lab. We could create a chamber with Earth-like conditions. Brian nodded slowly. That could work, but we'd need to get permission to adjust the environmental controls, and Kluvax has influence with the administration. He might block us. Perhaps, said a new voice from the doorway. I could be of assistance. They turned to see Mickey, a slender Arcturian with silvery skin and large, sensitive eyes that could perceive a much broader spectrum of light than human eyes. Arcturians were known for their expertise in environmental engineering. I heard about your challenge, Mickey said, slinking into the room with the characteristic grace of her species. Professor Kluvax refused my dissertation proposal last year because it contradicted his theories on plasma containment. I would very much enjoy seeing him proven wrong. Brian felt a spark of hope. You think you can help us create the right conditions for fire? Better, Mickey replied, her skin shimmering with what Brian had learned was Arcturian amusement. I can give you access to the environmental simulation chamber in the East Wing. It's designed to recreate the conditions of any known planet or celestial body. That's perfect, Brian exclaimed, then paused. But won't you get in trouble? Mickey made a dismissive gesture with one of her 4 upper limbs. I am the lead assistant for the department. I have legitimate access. As long as you file the proper research protocols, which I can help you with, we are operating within regulations. With Mickey's help, Brian began designing a controlled experiment that would demonstrate fire to the skeptical Xenthorian scientific community. They would need to carefully document each step to prove that no trickery was involved. As they worked, news of the challenge spread throughout the Institute. Many faculty members and students were openly betting on the outcome, with the odds heavily favoring Professor Kluvax. Some even suggested that humans had a collective delusion about fire and that Brian was attempting to perpetuate a cultural myth rather than demonstrate actual science. On the 3rd day of preparation, their work was interrupted by the arrival of Senior Administrator Vex, a stern Xenthorian known for his strict adherence to Institute policies. Mr. Foster, Vex said formally, I understand you are planning to conduct an experiment involving this fire phenomenon. Brian straightened up from the workbench where he had been assembling various materials. Yes, Administrator. We've filed all the proper documentation and safety protocols. Indeed, Vex acknowledged, his skin a neutral gray. However, Professor Kluvax has raised concerns about potential damage to Institute property. Fire, as you describe it, seems inherently destructive. With respect, Administrator, Mickey interjected, we've designed multiple safety measures. The demonstration will take place in a contained environment with emergency suppression systems standing by. Vex considered this, his 4 eyes blinking in an unsynchronized pattern that Brian had learned indicated deep thought among Xenthorians. Very well. But I will require additional safety officers to be present, and you must agree to terminate the experiment immediately if ordered to do so. Agreed, Brian said quickly, relieved that they weren't being shut down completely. After Administrator Vex left, Drex turned to Brian. This is becoming quite the event. I heard that representatives from the Galactic Science Council will be attending. Brian felt a wave of anxiety. Great, no pressure then. Do not worry, Mickey said reassuringly. The principles are sound. If fire exists on Earth, it can exist in our simulation chamber. Brian wasn't so sure. Despite their preparations, he was beginning to worry that some unknown factor in Xenthorian physics might prevent the reaction from occurring as it would on Earth. What if there was something fundamental about this region of space that altered the behavior of matter in ways humans hadn't yet discovered? On the morning of the demonstration, Brian arrived at the simulation chamber to find it surrounded by a crowd of eager spectators. News of the challenge had spread beyond the Institute, and now representatives from various species were present, along with recording devices that would broadcast the event across the Galactic Federation's scientific networks. Professor Kluvax stood near the entrance, his skin cycling between confident blue and smug purple. "Quite the audience you've attracted, Foster. It's unfortunate they'll all witness your failure." Brian chose not to respond to the taunt. Instead, he focused on his final preparations. Inside the chamber, they had created an Earth-like atmosphere and assembled a variety of materials: wood from Earth trees, part of Brian's personal research supplies, paper, a small amount of ethanol, and most importantly, several primitive fire-starting tools, including a flint and steel striker. Drex approached, his environmental suit freshly cleaned for the occasion. "Are you ready, Brian? The administrators want to begin in 10 minutes. Brian nodded, trying to appear more confident than he felt. "As ready as I'll ever be." At the appointed time, Administrator Vex called for attention. The crowd quieted as he explained the parameters of the demonstration. Professor Kluvax has asserted that the human concept of fire, a self-sustaining, heat and light-producing oxidation reaction, is a physical impossibility according to established galactic scientific principles. Exchange scientist Foster claims to be able to demonstrate that fire is not only possible, but is a common and controlled phenomenon on Earth. Both parties have agreed that a successful demonstration will require Professor Kluvax to revise his position on Earth chemistry. Professor Kluvax stepped forward. "I want it noted that I believe this entire exercise is a waste of valuable research resources. However, I am willing to observe this farce to put an end to these outlandish human claims once and for all." Brian took a deep breath and entered the simulation chamber, which had been fitted with a transparent viewing wall so the audience could observe. He wore a simple environmental suit that would allow him to breathe in the Earth-like atmosphere they had created, which would be toxic to many of the observing aliens. "I will now demonstrate the phenomenon humans call fire," Brian announced, his voice transmitted to the audience outside. "I'll begin with a simple demonstration using primitive methods that have been used on Earth for thousands of years." He arranged a small pile of tinder-dried grass and paper and took out the flint and steel. Several audience members leaned forward in curiosity. Professor Kluvax's skin had taken on a particularly vibrant shade of disbelieving blue. Brian struck the flint against the steel, creating a shower of sparks. Several aliens gasped at the brief flashes of light. He struck again, directing the sparks toward the tinder. A few caught, creating tiny glowing points that quickly faded. "Come on," Brian muttered to himself, striking again with more force. This time, several sparks landed in the perfect spot, and a tiny tendril of smoke began to rise from the tinder. Brian carefully lifted the smoking material and blew gently on it, encouraging the nascent embers. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, a small flame appeared, flickering tentatively in the Earth-like atmosphere. The audience erupted in a cacophony of sounds, gasps, clicks, buzzes, and exclamations in a dozen different languages. Professor Kluvax's skin had gone completely white, a sign of shock in Xenthorians. Carefully, Brian added small twigs to the flame, then larger pieces of wood. The fire grew, casting a warm orange glow throughout the chamber. The dancing flames reflected in the wide eyes and optical sensors of the watching aliens. "This," Brian announced with a hint of triumph in his voice, "is fire, a chemical reaction between oxygen and fuel, producing heat, light, and various byproducts including carbon dioxide and water vapor." Professor Kluvax had moved close to the viewing wall, his 4 eyes wide and unblinking. This is impossible," he muttered, but his skin had begun to take on a yellowish tinge, the Xenthorian equivalent of scientific curiosity. I assure you, Professor, it's very real, Brian replied. On Earth, we've been using controlled fire for cooking, warmth, and industrial processes for thousands of years. To further demonstrate, Brian carefully poured a small amount of ethanol onto a heat-resistant platform and ignited it, creating a different type of flame, one that burned with a nearly invisible blue color. Different substances produce different flame characteristics, he explained. This is ethanol burning. Notice the color difference and how it burns more quickly than the wood. For the next 20 minutes, Brian demonstrated various properties of fire, explaining combustion, oxygen requirements, and how humans had learned to control and contain the reaction. The audience watched in rapt attention, with many frantically taking notes or recording data. When Brian finally extinguished the flames and exited the chamber, he was met with a barrage of questions from excited scientists of various species. In the commotion, he lost sight of Professor Kluvax. "That was incredible," Drex exclaimed, his translator barely keeping up with his excited, bubbling speech. "The way the molecules visibly released energy, I've never seen anything like it." Mickey was equally enthused. "The spectrum of light emitted was fascinating. My eyes could perceive wavelengths that I don't believe your human vision can detect." As the initial excitement began to die down, Administrator Vex approached Brian. "Exchange Scientist Foster, Professor Kluvax has requested your presence in his laboratory. Immediately." Brian exchanged concerned glances with his friends. Was the professor going to dispute the results? Claim some kind of trickery? When Brian arrived at Kluvax's lab, he found the professor hunched over a series of instruments, his skin cycling through analytical patterns of green and yellow. "Professor," Brian said hesitantly. Kluvax looked up, his 4 eyes focusing on Brian. "Ah, Foster. Good. I need you to explain something." Brian braced himself for an argument, but instead Kluvax activated a holographic display showing the molecular analysis of the fire demonstration. "These readings," Kluvax said, his voice devoid of its usual condescension, "show energy transfers that contradict Zorvin's third law of molecular binding. Yet the reaction clearly occurred. How do you explain this discrepancy?" Surprised by the professor's scientific rather than defensive approach, Brian moved closer to examine the data. "Well, Earth scientists have observed that oxidation reactions follow different rules depending on the activation energy and available oxygen. It's possible that Zorvin's law needs to be amended to account for variations in atmospheric composition." Kluvax's skin pulsed with thoughtful green patterns. "Perhaps. Or perhaps there is a more fundamental principle at work that neither of our species has fully understood." He straightened up, all 4 eyes fixing on Brian. "I find myself in the unexpected position of having to revise not only my understanding of Earth chemistry, but potentially several established Xenthorian scientific principles as well." Brian was stunned. He had expected resistance, denial, or at best grudging acknowledgement. He hadn't prepared for genuine scientific curiosity. I'd be happy to collaborate on further research," Brian offered. "Yes, I believe that would be productive," Kluvax agreed. "Your fire may be more significant than either of us realized. If Zorvin's laws require revision, this could affect our understanding of countless chemical processes." Over the next several weeks, Brian found himself working closely with Professor Kluvax and a rapidly expanding team of scientists from various species, all eager to understand the implications of fire in a broader galactic context. What had begun as a challenge had evolved into one of the most significant cross-species research initiatives in the Institute's history. They discovered that while most advanced civilizations in the galaxy had bypassed fire due to their planet's atmospheric compositions or had evolved other energy production methods, the principles behind combustion could be applied to solve several long-standing problems in Galactic Federation technology, particularly in the areas of energy transfer and propulsion. 2 months after the demonstration, Brian stood beside Professor Kluvax as they presented their findings to the Galactic Science Council. The council chamber was filled with representatives from dozens of worlds, all attentive as Kluvax explained the revised principles of what was now being called Foster-Kluvax reaction dynamics. The human demonstration of fire, Kluvax stated, his skin a respectful shade of academic green, has forced us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about molecular behavior. By integrating Earth's empirical knowledge with our theoretical frameworks, we have developed a more comprehensive understanding that bridges the gap between our scientific traditions. Brian could hardly believe the transformation. The once dismissive professor now spoke of human science with respect, even admiration. As the presentation concluded to enthusiastic approval from the council, Kluvax turned to Brian. "I must acknowledge something, Foster," the professor said quietly. "My initial dismissal of your claims was not purely scientific. There was an element of what humans might call pride. I found it difficult to accept that a species so new to galactic society might possess knowledge that contradicted our established principles." Brian nodded in understanding. Scientific progress often requires challenging our most basic assumptions. That's true for humans, too. "Indeed," Kluvax agreed, "and I have learned that wisdom can come from unexpected sources. Your simple fire has ignited a much larger flame of discovery." As they left the council chamber, they were approached by Administrator Vex, whose usual stern demeanor had softened considerably. "The Institute Board has unanimously approved the establishment of a new Department of Cross-Species Scientific Integration," Vex announced, "and they request that you both serve as co-chairs." Brian was speechless. From nearly being dismissed as a scientific fraud to heading a new department at the Galactic Institute, all because he had insisted that fire was possible. "I would be honored," he finally managed to say. "As would I," Kluvax added, his skin glowing with a rare shade of pleased orange. "I believe we have only begun to explore the potential of combining our different scientific perspectives." Later that evening, Brian met with Drex and Mickey at one of the Institute's social gathering spaces. They celebrated with drinks appropriate to their respective biologies. "To fire," Drex toasted, raising his container of bubbling methane-based nutrition, the impossible phenomenon that changed galactic science. "To questioning assumptions," Mickey added, her silvery skin reflecting the ambient light beautifully. "And to new discoveries," Brian concluded. "May we never stop being surprised by the universe." As they enjoyed their celebration, Brian couldn't help but reflect on how something as simple and fundamental to human existence as fire had proven revolutionary in this advanced galactic community. It reminded him that knowledge wasn't just about technological sophistication, but about the unique perspectives that different evolutionary paths provided. 6 months later, the first Galactic Conference on Terrestrial Sciences was held, with delegations from 17 worlds participating. The main exhibition hall featured a carefully controlled demonstration of various Earth combustion technologies, from simple campfires to internal combustion engines and rocket propellants. Professor Kluvax, now widely respected for his work in integrating Earth science into the galactic knowledge base, gave the opening address. "One standard year ago, I stood before exchange scientist Foster and declared that fire was an impossibility," he began, his skin cycling through humble shades of blue and green. "I was wrong, but more importantly, I was close-minded. This conference stands as a testament to what we can achieve when we approach the universe with curiosity rather than certainty." Brian, seated in the front row, felt a profound sense of accomplishment. What had begun as a simple desire to defend human science had evolved into something much more significant, a bridge between Earth and the wider galactic community. After the conference, a new exchange program was established, allowing scientists from throughout the Federation to visit Earth and study its unique chemical and physical phenomena firsthand. Conversely, human scientists were welcomed on dozens of worlds to share their perspectives and learn from other species. 1 year to the day after Brian's fire demonstration, a permanent exhibit was installed at the Galactic Institute of Xenoscience. At its center was a simple glass case containing the original flint and steel that Brian had used. The accompanying plaque read, "With these simple tools, exchange scientist Brian Foster of Earth demonstrated that even the most established scientific principles should always remain open to revision. The fire he created not only proved a physical phenomenon, but ignited a new era of cross-species scientific collaboration." Professor Kluvax had insisted on the wording himself. As Brian stood looking at the exhibit, Drex approached and stood beside him. "You have become quite famous, my friend," Drex said, his bubbling voice conveying amusement. "There are now 3 scientific principles named after you." Brian laughed. "All because I refused to accept that something I'd known all my life was impossible." "Sometimes," Drex replied thoughtfully, "the most important scientific breakthroughs come not from discovering the unknown, but from helping others see what has been in front of them all along." Brian nodded, watching as a group of young alien students gathered around the exhibit, their various sensory organs focused intently on the simple tools that had changed their understanding of the universe. "What will you challenge next?" Drex asked. "Now that you've revolutionized our understanding of chemical reactions, perhaps you could tackle quantum entanglement. I hear Professor Zirl insists that instant communication across vast distances is theoretically impossible." Brian grinned. "One impossible thing at a time, Drex. Though now that you mention it, there is this thing we humans call radio waves." As they walked away from the exhibit, Brian felt a sense of both accomplishment and anticipation. In proving that fire was possible, he had opened doors not just for himself, but for all of humanity. Earth's integration into the galactic community had accelerated beyond anyone's expectations, all because one human had refused to accept that something he knew to be true could be impossible. The universe, it seemed, still had plenty of surprises in store, even for those who had been studying it for millennia. And sometimes, the most revolutionary ideas were also the most fundamental. Fire, that ancient human tool, had ignited a new age of discovery that would burn brightly across the stars for generations to come. And it had all started because an alien professor claimed fire was impossible, and a human built one anyway.